I'm Heidi Freeb.
And I'm Denzel Mensa.
We talked about how that was going to be our intro. I think we nailed it.
Yes, we did a good job this time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about personality type and gender and how those two things influence each other.
So, Belinda said, what are the most masculine slash feminine seeming types, and how would they manifest in someone who had the opposing gender? My opinion of the most masculine types are ENTJ and ESTJ. And for those of you who know about the cognitive functions, I believe it's because TE is just such a, according to society, it seems like such a very masculine function. And so I think about like people like who are in the task force. They just take a lead and they just like sort of kind of have this, oh, I forgot to consider your feelings type of, or like take charge type of attitude. And that's what comes off to me as masculine, according to how society defines it. And when an ENTJ female sort of like takes like lead in that type of way, or like uses a lot of TE, then a lot of people are like, whoa, like that she seems sort of masculine, or she seems like very like masculine, I guess is the word. Like, we're just not used to seeing females take charge in such a very straightforward, logical type of way. And so, yeah, that's my opinion on the most masculine types. And the most feminine, in my opinion, is INFP and ISFJ. And I think this is because INFPs, they are so in tune with their FI, and the male INFPs that I know, this is just something that I've noticed. They always seem to look kind of like somber and sad. And they're not feminine per se. Like, I don't really see them as feminine, but because they're so in tune with their own emotions, then they can come off in that way. But then I think of people like Kendrick Lamar. He's definitely not feminine, but he can possibly come off in that way because of how in tune with his emotions he is. And then ISFJs, they're so seemingly maternal, and so and then being reserved on top of that, that can also come off as feminine, in my opinion.
I think an interesting thing to explore is where we're even getting those ideas of what's masculine and what's feminine to begin with. 70% of men identify as thinkers the last time they polled, and then 70% of women identified as feelers. And this study's kind of been replicated over the years, and that's pretty consistently what they find. So I think our idea of what is masculine is in a lot of ways shaped, apart from like biological differences between men and women. It's also shaped by the fact that so many men identify as thinkers, so we come to associate the thinking trait with men. And then on the flip side, so many women identify as feelers, so we come to identify the feeling trait with women. But of course, that's not always the case. But I would say that would be a big component as to why we tend to, both of the types you mentioned are thinking dominant types, and they're also extroverted types. So I think there's a very big bias to look at thinking dominant types as more masculine, just because statistically more men are thinkers, and then to look at feeling dominant types, which would be ISFPs, INFPs, ESFJs, and ENFJs, as more feminine, because historically more feelers have been females than vice versa, and same works for males and thinkers. So I agree basically that your feeling dominant females are going to be perceived as more feminine, as the most feminine types. And then your thinking dominant males are going to be perceived as the most masculine types. If I were to pick one for each type, I would say the kind of stereotypical masculine male I see as the ESTJ. Yeah. Because they're also the most common male type, which is really notable. So it's kind of that type that we come to associate with masculinity, because I think in something like 13%, I'm not sure if that's the 100% correct statistic, but it's around there. 13-ish% of the population is ESTJ, and the majority of those are male. And then on the flip side, I would say ESFJ is the type we tend to most strongly identify as very feminine, because again, that's a 13-ish% of the population, which is mostly female. So I think
Yeah, that
those
makes
two
sense.
tend to kind of set a lot of the norms for what we view as feminine and masculine, just because they make up such a large proportion of their own genders, respectively.
Yeah, yeah, I could agree with that.
Madeline on Twitter asked, "Do you think there's more pressure on women and feeling men to be the opposite of their type, to act the opposite of their type?" So, because most feelers are women, if you're a male with a feeling preference, is there pressure, or do you feel like, or do most of them feel like there's pressure to act like they have a thinking preference? And on the flip side, do females who are thinkers feel pressure to act as though they have a feeling preference? Because again, that's statistically more normal for females. And not to throw this back at you again, Denzel, but I think being a male who is a dominant feeler, because you lead with extroverted feeling, I think you're a really good person to kind of have the first say on this, because that's something that directly impacts you, I'm sure.
Yeah, so I'll definitely go ahead and say that when I first just came across MBTI and discovered that I was a feeler, then I was like, ugh, like I was really annoyed by that. Because ironically, growing up, I mean, I didn't know about MBTI growing up, but now that I know about it, looking at the characters online or like on TV and stuff that I used to like really look up to, they were mostly ISTPs and like other like thinker types, and I wanted to be more like that. And so when I saw like I was a feeler, and then I learned about the cognitive functions, and it's like, oh wow, I'm a dominant feeler. Then I was very like annoyed by that. But then I started learning more about everything that extroverted feeling entails, and just like every cognitive function, there's so many faces to it. But one of the things that I've realized that extroverted feeling entails is it looks at what society, like at roles in society. So if my FE picks up that this is what it looks like to be masculine, then I'm going to naturally, without thinking, start to emulate that. And that's one like kind of advantage from being a extroverted feeler male, because I still have the emotional intelligence that most women have to be able to deal with other females and even males who are like having that type of emotional struggle that most thinker dominants aren't able to really like handle. But then I'm also able to take charge, which I usually do. Like ever since I was a kid, I've always been the one that's like taking charge and in lead. And so I never really saw myself as feminine. And I looked at other people such as like Martin Luther King Jr., who was also ENFJ, Nelson Mandela, and I saw like how they used their emotional intelligence for good. And I just learned to really embrace that feeler dominant type of thing while still embracing my masculinity in that way.
I love what you said about using your FE to pick up on kind of signals of what you might be expected to act like in your environment, because that was actually an argument that I heard on this exact topic years ago, and unfortunately I can't remember the source of it, but someone was saying that with ESFJ men, it's often difficult to peg them as ESFJs because having dominant extroverted feeling backed up by introverted sensing, so you're kind of scanning your environment, seeing how others are behaving, how maybe you're expected to behave, and then you're attaching that to tradition and traditional roles, and that might include traditional gender roles, depending on how those were drilled into you or not in your childhood and growing up. But they said it's actually difficult to tell with these ESFJ males often because they've so internalized the role they believe that they're meant to play that they'll come across as thinkers. And I think that's a lot of what you were saying too. And then that has me wondering, does that work in the opposite direction for thinking females? Like I'm thinking if you're an ENTJ or an ESTJ female, because they look at things as very goal-oriented, I wonder, and this is something I don't have the evidence or the information to back up, but I wonder if that might incline them a little bit to say, okay, these are the traits that people respond well to in women. Therefore, this might help me get my way here, here, here if I emulate these characteristics. And that might make it a little bit difficult to tell them apart from, say, ESFJs, if they're kind of playing that game, so to speak, because they see it as beneficial to them.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe that would possibly come across with ENTP females, which was what I've seen because they have FE as a tertiary. So their maternal side sort of like comes up, and that FE like picks up on like, okay, this is what society sort of like wants me to be like, and they're seemingly like more like laid back.
There was a couple people on my Facebook page who were kind of arguing that whether you're a feeler or thinker is solely based on your estrogen versus testosterone levels, which, you know, it's an interesting theory to explore, but at the end of the day, that doesn't make sense because every female has higher estrogen levels than every male, and every male has less testosterone levels than every female. But it does probably have a huge influence on how your type is expressed, because I think there are significant, well, there obviously are significant biological differences between men and women that will show up in the expression of type. And I think a really interesting point in that article that we were looking at was when Dario Nardi referenced the research of someone whose article I actually couldn't find. It was someone with the last name Meyer, but he was doing some sort of research on type and gender, and he concluded that women are actually more likely to use all of the functions in their stack more evenly than men, who on average tend to rely on like their first couple of functions a little bit more, or certain functions that they can choose a little bit more. I thought it was really interesting. That's never really been explored in the type world before. But I was wondering if that could have a big effect on how, for example, if you have an ENTP or ESTP woman, for example, who has feeling in the third place in their stacking, maybe it comes more naturally for them to tune into that. So you have them developing that feeling function earlier than they would if you had a male who was an ENTP or an ESTP. They might not tap into that feeling function until later in life, because there might actually be differences in how fully we're developing our stacks.
I read this on typeinmind.com in the INTP's profile, and it said that INTP females, they tend to really get a grasp of their FE a lot quicker than INTP males do. And from what I've seen, like knowing people like Emma and people like Angela and other INTP females I know, and then in contrast with other INTP males that I know, it's like, okay, I can definitely see how being women, they naturally do just have like a more fluid way of not only expressing their feelings, but like also like dealing with their feelings, because they hang out with other women who are usually FE users. And so they're like, okay, I'm getting more of a grasp on how to use FE by sort of imitating what my friends are doing from a young age, as opposed to maybe like INTP males, for example, they're probably already like hanging out with other males, so they're thinkers usually, and they don't really feel as inclined to resonate with their feeling function.
I think because FE is a lot more responsive to its environment. As an FE user, male, like you said before, it might be easier to kind of pick up on social cues and go, okay, this is how I can take my unique personality and blend it with my environment and make sense of that. Whereas with introverted feeling, you're focused on how you're perceiving your own identity and what it means to you. And that can be something that's very difficult to communicate with, or to communicate to others. You feel like it's not going to be well received. And that happens, you know, even as I have introverted feeling second, and I'm a woman. So both of those things are, you know, quite statistically normal for my demographic, but I still find it difficult a lot of the time to express, you know, my authentic self, what I'm feeling. So I can't imagine how difficult it would be for people who had introverted feeling, but didn't see themselves modeled very much either in the media or in their peers. And that might create a very big internal conflict of how much myself can I really reveal to people? How will my self-image be perceived? And I would almost expect that that would be the most difficult function to have as a dominant function in gender or sex, less common as well. FE can kind of pick up on other things. Introverted feeling, it's a lot more identity based, and it's a lot more internal. So I think that would be a really tough one to navigate. I feel like we just got started. Like, I feel like we could have talked about this for another half hour, if not 2 hours. Yeah,
2 hours.
Cans of worms opening everywhere. But we do only have half an hour tonight. So as we've already said, leave any questions in the comments. We'll be checking them over the next couple of days. We'll respond to as many as we can. All right. Next time, we have to figure out a sign off now that we have our sign on. So for tonight, we'll just say good night.
Good night.
I'm David Bowder, CEO of SPA Sigma. Every day, each of us is surrounded by a great diversity of people, and indeed, personalities. Some people we find it very easy to relate to. Others, not so much so. Our program exists to help you make sense of your own personality, as well as the diverse personalities around you, to help you improve both your personal and professional lives. Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true." We'll teach you to understand how to reach the diverse personalities around you, to communicate with them in a way that integrates who you are with who they are. So enough talk about all this. Welcome to SPA Sigma's Personality Quotient PQ program. Enjoy the journey.